Cops have a right to murder black people. No, this is not clickbait, and I'm not just saying that just to be provocative. Yes, it is disgusting, and yet being disgusted doesn't make it any less true. It is an easily observable fact. It has been that way since the inception of the police, and it will remain that way until we change it. What is a right? I believe that the way that we typically view rights is misguided. It only leads us to this ongoing cycle of hope and aspiration and never actually realizing a right. Today, I'm going to provide a simple, clear breakdown of what a right is in an effort to give us a framework that will allow us to establish, maintain, and protect our rights. I'm just Mike, and this is Drawing the Line. To start, it's important to recognize that a right is different from a law. If you are black and have been in the U.S. and paying at least a little bit of attention to your surroundings, then I don't have to explain to you the fact that laws do not equal rights. Laws are not universally, objectively enforced, and in fact, many times the laws that are designed to protect us are actually used to benefit other groups of people. The Voting Rights Act did more for white women than it did for black people or any other people of color. Also with the Voting Rights Act, we have examples where the actual laws that we have fought for have been turned back on us and weaponized to incriminate us, to attempt to imprison us. For instance, currently, right now, in St. Petersburg, Florida, Omali Yeshitela, who is the founder and head of the UHURU movement, along with a couple of other comrades, are facing trumped-up criminal charges. They're being accused of being Russian agents, and among the offenses that they're being accused of is violating the Voting Rights Act, the very act that Yeshitela was a part of bringing into existence because he was formerly a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was an instrumental group during the Civil Rights Movement. He and his comrades were fighting for liberation, and the government gave a concession codifying the Voting Rights Act of 1964, and now that very same Voting Rights Act is being weaponized to potentially imprison members of the UHURU movement. It's important that we recognize this case because it is establishing a precedent for this Black Scare era that we are in. These same kind of tactics were used back during the McCarthyism era, during the so-called Red Scare period, where they would try to link you to Russia as a means to incriminate you and accuse you of treason and throw the book at you, typically connected with some other trumped-up charges that they just made up. This is happening again because, as I've stated before, colonizers are not very creative. They regurgitate the same tactics over and over again, and now we see this happening in Florida, and we hear clearly in the rhetoric that this idea of foreign invaders, foreign influencers, puppets of foreign regimes is going to be a continual propaganda point and an attack strategy used by the powers that be. The main way that we look at rights is from a moral perspective. Rights are about what's good, what's just, what's fair. Rights protect us from wrongs. There are things that we are naturally supposed to have a right to as human beings. Human rights. It's often said that the first law of nature is survival. Living creatures will act in a way that ensures their survival. A human right is a need. Needs are non-negotiable. No matter how long you are forced to live without a need, it is still needed. It is still necessary for you to continue to live and thrive. When you are deprived of it, you will deteriorate, and it is inevitable that you will perish much quicker than it would be had you had that need met. So human rights are necessary. We need them. They are fundamentally right. They are naturally right. There are things that we as human beings are supposed to have access to, that we are supposed to be entitled to, that we are supposed to experience in order to be fully ourselves, our natural selves. But here's the thing about human rights. I've never had them, nor have you. My mother and father, my grandfathers and grandmothers, their grandfathers and grandmothers have all existed in a world where we have been denied our human rights. For multiple generations, our ancestors were born into and ultimately transitioned out of a world where they never experienced a single day liberated as free human beings, as fully self-actualized human beings, as human beings who did not live under the heel of an oppressive society. What this means is that not just me personally, but even the people before me who brought me into being have never known rights as anything other than aspirational. They did not exist. We did not have our human rights. We only know rights as something that we are fighting for. And we have fought relentlessly. We have never stopped fighting against oppression. We have never stopped fighting for liberation. We have never stopped fighting to have our human rights. And despite that, we only know rights as aspirations. We have gotten so removed from our past, pre-colonial times of a society that had rights, that we don't know the experience of what it means to have rights in this society. And this is part of the trap of looking at rights as a moral issue. It makes you latch on to hope, onto aspiration. Just recently at the Democratic National Convention, you had Michelle Obama get up and she talked about hope is making a comeback. An ode to her husband, who was former president, who ran his campaign on hope and change. Hope, aspiration, the idea that one day we could possibly be free if we just have patience and wait long enough and hope hard enough. It is ingrained into the psychological warfare that is waged against black people. Looking at rights as a moral issue, as an aspirational thing, as a theoretical concept, is killing us. Claiming rightful ownership is not the same thing as possession. Say I own a car. Someone comes into my driveway, takes my car, drives away. I have the paperwork to show that I own that car. I still even have the keys in my house. I have pictures of me in front of the car. I have all of the evidence, the provenance to show that that car is mine. I own it, and yet I do not possess it. We can righteously claim that we are supposed to have human rights, but we do not possess human rights. Before Eurasians came in and attacked and successfully invaded and colonized and displaced black people in Africa, there was a time for thousands of years where black people lived in societies that were based in being in tune with nature, that were developed with the self-actualization of the members of that society in mind. There were clearly established rights that human beings had. There were norms that human beings experienced throughout their lives that affirmed their importance, their value as human beings. We were dispossessed of those rights through invasion, through colonization, through enslavement. Lawyers have a saying that possession is 9/10 of the law. This means that who was in possession of something when events unfolded will heavily impact the way that you perceive those events, the way that people should behave in the context of the events as they unfold. Say I'm sitting in my car and I see someone walking down the street and they're peeking into the windows of cars. Look kind of suspicious. I don't know who this person is. I have some choices to make. I could lock my door. I could pull off and go find a different place to park. I could get on the phone and text my neighbors and say, hey, I see someone looking at your car. There are many different things that I can do in the situation that do not involve confronting this person who potentially may be coming to take my car, who may be challenging the ownership of my car. The situation is different if my car is stolen and I go by a gas station and I see a guy get out of my car at the gas station to go in and pay for gas. It's going to be a completely different situation that unfolds. I'm going to be put in a position where in order to repossess my car, I'm going to have to accept that there's going to be a conflict with this person because they have claimed ownership of my car. They have possession of my car. There is no way for me to get my car back without some kind of confrontation. And some people will say, well, you could call the police. First of all, don't do that, because the police may show up and decide that you are the problem and not the person who stole your car. Secondly, even if you do that, you are still calling someone else to directly confront this person who has taken possession of something that you rightfully own. And so there is no way to deal with rights when you have been dispossessed of them that does not involve directly coming into conflict with the person who has dispossessed you of those rights. So we need to reframe the way we look at rights. We need to look at rights as tangible and observable. A right is a pattern of behavior that you routinely experience throughout the course of your life. You can point to it. You can witness it. You can recall experiences of that right being enacted in your life. But how do we get that when we've been dispossessed of it? How do we get a right in a society that cannot function without the dehumanization of black people? When we talk about rights, it's important to understand that rights are not individual. Rights are a collective societal phenomenon. Rights are always collective, but that does not mean that rights are universal. A group of people can establish a right that other communities do not have access to. The U.S. Declaration of Independence is beautiful language. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, while enslaving millions of Africans. Not only was it obvious based on our condition at the time that they were not talking about us, they went on to have conversations where they clearly stated and decided that, I think you're about 3/5 of a person. On countless occasions, they have implicitly and explicitly told us that the laws that they come up with, that the rights that they instill in this society do not apply to us. When a community collectively aspires to have a right, then the first step to taking that from conception, from an aspiration to reality, is to publicly and clearly declare the right. To look at the norm and reject the norm by stating what you now have decided the norm is supposed to be. Declaration does not mean that the right exists, but is an important first step. Once you have declared a right, then a community has to take action. We have to take action in a way that brings about a new normative pattern of behavior. We have to assert a right. We have to institute it. In order to institute a right, we have to create institutions. Institutions are organized groups of people who develop processes, ways of using the resources that we have available to us in order to establish and maintain a pattern of behavior. If the goal is liberation, then one of the things that has to be done is to alleviate the dependence of our communities on our oppressors. If you do not have institutions that empower us to provide our own resources, then we cannot have autonomy, because we will have to stay in line and meet the requirements of the people that we depend on for the resources that we need. And so when you look at groups like the Black Panther Party, they develop survival programs. These are institutions that were designed not just to provide a need, but to demonstrate to people that we can provide for our own needs. Now, it's hard enough to bring together people and to get organized and to come up with processes to harness resources in an effort to shift the pattern of behavior. That is a monumental task in and of itself. But even once you do that, you don't have an institution yet. The fundamental thing that makes something an institution is that the power is transferable. All around the world, in impoverished black communities, you have nonprofits. You have NGOs, non-government organizations. And a lot of these organizations promote themselves, they brand themselves as human rights organizations or civil rights organizations. And yet, when you actually look at the structure of the project or organization, you can tell that it's not really a community institution. And as I've said before, a right can only be established by the community whom the right is being established for. You cannot be given a right. So you have these NGOs, and a large portion of their staff is people who are not from the community. And in most cases, when you do have staff that are from the community, they're at the lower levels. They have no real decision-making power. These people who are not from the community, who run these organizations, are also not living in the community as they run the organization. And a large percentage of their budget goes to salary and benefits. So automatically, these well-funded NGOs, well-funded nonprofits who claim to be working towards human rights, they are working backwards, because the majority of the money, the majority of the resources that they have are actually never even touching the community. They are given to people who are outside of the community, and they are spent outside of the community. If you're going to build an institution with the intent to establish a right, then the organizing efforts, the processes, practices, and the way that you harness resources, the know-how to do that, and the resources themselves have to be transferable to the community that is working towards establishing the right. If you have a project or organization and the organization cannot transcend the people who are running it, then it is going to fizzle out. And whatever progress you're able to make is going to be easily compromised and rolled back as soon as the people leave, because people come and go. People come into an organization, there's a split, people leave. Organizations are intentionally dismantled and repressed by the government. People will pass away. And so being transferable is a key aspect of building an institution. And in the case of establishing a right, then it is best that the institution be comprised primarily of the people who are of that community. And if it is not, there has to be a very intentional process to ensure that the knowledge base and the resources are transferred to members of the community, so that members of the community can continue the process of managing and maintaining and protecting the right. When it comes to the majority of NGOs and nonprofits, this kind of approach is deemed counterproductive. One, because these organizations are jobs programs. Their fundamental goal tends to be to raise enough money to cover the salaries and benefits of the employees, in particular the administrative, the high-level employees, and then whatever is left over you use for programming, for organizing efforts. The other reason that this is counterproductive is that you want to continue getting funding. And the funding tends to come from rich people who have vested interests in making sure that communities aren't actually empowered by these NGOs, by these nonprofits. It gives them a good PR article to say, hey, look at the $1 million or $10 million we donated to such and such, without having any true material impact on the conditions and the patterns of behavior within a community and how other communities interact with the community. In order for a right to be possessed by a community, the community has to have ownership of it. And when I say the community, I mean people of the community, not necessarily just from the community. Because someone can be from the community and isolate themselves from the normal day-to-day ongoings of a community. Someone can be from a community and leave that community and adopt different values, different objectives, different standards. They can have different aspirations, and then they can come back to the community and bring in their own agenda. So I can't just say, I'm black, You're black, therefore we're a part of the black community, and that's the only criteria that I need to meet. Or I'm black and working class, or black and some other intersectionality. I mean specifically the same local geographic area that is being organized, because all neighborhoods, all communities have subtle nuances. They have internal politics that are at play. People have, this person has an old grudge with that person, this person is very resourceful in this way, and this person brings these skills to the table. And only someone who is of a community is in a position to really fully digest and understand the array of resources that are available to that community, and figure out a way to not just harness them for right now, but to continually harness those resources in order to make sure that the right is maintained once it's established, and that the right is protected, because it will come under attack. Of the community means that it's someone who's spent several years living the day-to-day realities of the community, not just in the past, but also who is in tune with the movement within the community currently. Someone who has spent years cultivating meaningful, mutually beneficial relationships within the community, who is recognized by the community as a part of the community. Even in cases when we find that the leadership of nonprofit organizations or NGOs has some kind of historical tie to a community, there is a long buffer period in which they have been disentangled from the community and groomed to make sure that they will not challenge the status quo as they go back and re-engage the community. I believe that the goal of an organizer should be to be a catalyst for people to empower themselves, not to bring power to people, but to gather people together, introduce them to information and practices and systems of knowledge, and to help them cultivate the skills that they need in order to assert their rights. Rights do not emerge out of thin air. We are born into a society with very well-established norms. A right is conceived when the needs and desires of a community come into conflict with the established norms of the society. Rights always emerge in conflict. Rights are never accepted without coming into conflict with those who have a vested interest in the existing norms within a society. A right is never given. If someone has the power to give you a right, then they have the power to take it away, and therefore it is never a right at all. A right emerges in conflict with existing rights, and it cannot be considered established until it has dismantled and discarded all of the rights that are in conflict with it. Anything that a community deems worth declaring as a right will inevitably come under attack, both by internal forces who are uncomfortable with change and external forces who have a vested interest in making sure that change does not happen. This is why cops exist. You will never stop oppressed humans from hungering for the ability to live fully human lives. We need, it is our nature, it is our need to be fully actualized human beings. It is the way that we are intended to be. And there's a lot you can do to suppress that, to hold it back, to trick people into thinking that they are nourishing themselves when they are actually poisoning themselves and stopping their ability to fight. You can systematically set up ways to ensure that a community remains malnourished. You can give them poor health care. You can give them an education that creates a sense of alienation and breeds poor self-esteem, a broken self-image. You can force them into cycles of debt and convince them that they should still buy into a system that steals all of their time and all of their energy. You can create conditions that force them to fight over resources and then incarcerate them and convince them that they are the problem. Not the intentional sabotaging of resources, but something in their nature makes them criminal. You can do all of these things, but the need will remain a need. Our need to live as fully self-actualized people, our need to affirm ourselves as black people will continue to exist. You will find generation after generation of people who see through it. Even in the most opaque situations where we have been displaced from our sense of self and our history, we will still find clarity in who we are and what we are entitled to, what is right, what is righteous, what we are supposed to have, how we are supposed to live. And so, despite all of these mechanisms of sabotage that exist, at the heart of it, you have to have the relentless and continuous onslaught of violence. And that is why cops are essential to the maintenance of oppression. There needs to be a physical presence, a violent patrolling force that lets people know you are only a wrong turn away from getting beat down or getting shot in the street. We live in an oppressive society, and a society that is built on the perpetual oppression of masses of people is one that must be, by default, committed to death. It must be committed to our destruction. And if we recognize that we are in a society that is committed to our demise, if we recognize that rights come about in conflict with norms in society, when we talk about creating institutions that establish a right, then we also have to talk about mechanisms for protection. A right cannot be solidified without developing systems of protecting that right. And therefore, we have to build institutions like the Black Liberation Army, like Los Macheteros in Puerto Rico, like the Mau Mau in Kenya, like the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And even looking at today, we have the Alliance of the Sahel States, where Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso are getting together and forming a federation in order to fight off the colonizers, in order to rid themselves of dependence on colonizers. We have in the Sudan the formation of neighborhood resistance committees, which are small groups of people who have taken action into their own hands and who are a formidable force in the current fight that's still ongoing in the Sudan that will determine who actually has the power. Does it go to the government? Does it go to the military or militias? Or does it go to the masses of the people? If we have come together as a community, as a collective, and it doesn't have to be everyone in the community, but if a group of people, a critical mass of people have come together and declared something as a right, has said publicly and clearly that we want this pattern of behavior to be our norm. If we have done that, and then we have moved on to create institutions that have developed processes where we can find ways to use the resources we have to establish the right. If we have built these institutions in a way that they are transferable to other people, making sure that if you eliminate or get rid of some of us, that some others of us will come along and take over the institution. If we have built the institution in a way that acknowledges that rights emerge in conflict, and we have built systems of protection into the institution, if we have built systems of accountability into the institution, if we have come up with protocols for dealing with people who threaten the institution, then we can say at that point that we have a right, that it is in our possession. If we look at rights this way, from this material perspective, if we look at rights as something that should be observable, something that we experience as normal within our lives, then we can very quickly determine what now in our lives is a right that we possess, is a right that is real, and what is a right that is aspirational. We can also begin the process of laying out a plan to take a right from the point of aspiration and conception to the point of declaration, to the point of institution, to the point of being a realized and protected right. If you can gather some people who are serious, some people who share similar values, some people who share a similar vision, some people who are willing to share in the work, then you have a community of people. And if you can get that community to come together and agree on what rights they aspire to establish, then all that's left is two things. The first is resources. You have to figure out what resources you have. And if you don't have adequate resources, you have to figure out what resources you need and a way to get those resources. And that just requires some ingenuity, some creative thinking, some improvisation. And that is our wheelhouse as black people. We are improvisers. We are syncopators. We always leave room for putting your own stamp on something, putting your own creativity into something. And so the first thing is resourcefulness. You have a community, you need to cultivate the resources that you have to move towards the things that you want. The second thing is we have to answer the question, what are we willing to sacrifice in order to establish these rights? How much time, how much energy, how much effort, how much are we willing to give? How much are we willing to lose in order to win? If you've enjoyed this video, then I encourage you to like, subscribe, share, comment, and engage with this video. Make sure that you click the notification bell so that you can be notified when new videos come out. Until next time, I'm Just Mike, and this is Drawing the Line.